All right, the clock is ticking. Week 1 is behind us, and this is the College Football Power Hour. He is Jason Fitz, that is Adam Breneman, and I am Caroline Fenton. We are here breaking down all of the action from Week 1, the biggest game of the day. All eyes were on College Station. Notre Dame takes down Texas A&M 23-13 at Kyle Field. Riley Leonard's debut as a Golden Domer. Adam, we'll start with you. Your biggest takeaways from this game.
Riley Leonard took Notre Dame into Texas A&M's territory, Kyle Field, and got a big win. I mean, that's the story for Notre Dame. Their transfer quarterback from Duke playing against his old head coach, Mike Elko, who took the Texas A&M job and got the job done. I thought Riley Leonard looked like a great passer in the pocket. He looked confident. He looked poised and also looked mobile. He was moving around really well. When Riley Leonard is healthy, we saw it last year a little bit. Then he got hurt. When he's healthy, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. This Notre Dame defense is elite. They fly around. I think they're a top 2 defense in the country. And you look at Notre Dame's schedule. I mean, there's a chance they go 12-0. Their toughest games remaining, Louisville. They go to Georgia Tech. They play Florida State. And they got to go to USC. I mean, those are their toughest games on that schedule. And 11-1, 12-0, all very likely for Notre Dame right now. And they'll be looking at a 5 seed in the college football playoff. Marcus Freeman's got a lot of buy-in from his guys at Notre Dame. And you can see when he got that job, the players were fired up. You can see how his players are playing for him right now. And Riley Leonard's the epitome of that.
Yeah, I think also, if we're going to sit here and talk about Riley Leonard, let's talk about what was in front of him. That was an offensive line that's being rebuilt. You've got tackles that are in the NFL, obviously, injury issues on that offensive line. Early on, it felt like Texas A&M was just getting right through that thing. It was like a sieve, and they were going through it. But Riley's mobility was big, and I thought the play calling was good. A lot of screens. They were doing a lot to the running backs, like just getting the ball out of his hands quickly. And it was interesting because Riley never felt overwhelmed, even though he had somebody in his face the entire game. You mentioned the teams they're going to play. They're not going to play a defensive line that has as much weight and as much star power as Texas A&M's did, and they managed to get through that game. I won't say that the offensive line was great, but they held up enough to really give Riley the opportunity to push the ball, and that's everything. And this is what Notre Dame has wanted for the last few years, is a quarterback that helped get them out of bad situations. Riley did a really nice job of that. At Texas A&M, sort of separate conversation that I think there were real problems with their offensive execution. Their quarterback play was terrible. But if we're looking at Notre Dame, you're right. Like, Caroline, this looks like a playoff caliber football team to me, because they now have what the committee can bank on for the rest of the year. They have a signature win by going over to Texas A&M, getting the win.
They played like a playoff caliber football team, and I think that they have a schedule that bodes very well to find themselves in the college football playoff. I look at the schedule, and I don't see a game that I can circle and say, ooh, that's going to be a tough one, or that's an automatic loss for Notre Dame. I think that 12-0 is very much so in the cards for Notre Dame. But I think that if we're going to talk about Notre Dame and how they looked, I think it's only fair to talk about how this game was close until it wasn't. How this game was a physical, how it was a tough defensive battle, tied 6-6 at half, and it was tied 13-13 up into the last few minutes of the game. So I'll give credit where credit is due to Texas A&M, that defensively, they made life hard for Riley Leonard. And I think the final numbers in the box score don't really indicate how difficult it was at times for both teams to run the football, both teams over 150 rushing yards. But I'll give credit to Texas A&M's defense. I think that is going to be the strength of their team, at least until Connor Wigman is able to settle down a little bit. But that was really the issue for me, Fitz. You pointed out, I didn't expect Connor Wigman to look as rattled as he looked at times. 2 dumb interceptions. They weren't throw them up YOLO balls at the end of the game. We have to get the ball out, and it just happens to get intercepted. They were bad interceptions thrown right to the defenders. That's a concern for me for Texas A&M moving forward.
Especially when you start talking about how sticky that coverage was. Because, Adam, I think you make a really good point. That secondary is great. So when you have opportunities, especially if they're softer on coverage in a couple of spots, and you've got a guy on an out route, like throwing on the outside to the hashes was just impossible, right? Yeah. It wasn't happening. And one of those picks was a back foot, lofted up, and it goes straight to the secondary. And you just look at it and you think, what are you doing, man? Like, in a game that was this close, Texas A&M in some ways defeated themselves because they couldn't complete the easy passes. And you're looking at it thinking, man, what have you been practicing for the last several months if you can't hit the guy when he's just running on green grass, man?
Yeah, and I think, guys, one of the other factors for this Notre Dame team that gets me excited about them is their offensive coordinator, Mike Denbrock, who came from LSU and was the coordinator responsible for kind of reviving Jaden Daniels' career at LSU. I was with Jaden Daniels when he was at Arizona State, and this was a completely different player when Jaden Daniels was at LSU playing for Mike Denbrock. Now Denbrock comes to Notre Dame and gets to develop Riley Leonard. And what Denbrock does from giving quarterbacks confidence, from allowing them to play within the system. And Riley Leonard doesn't need to go out there and put up 50 points every game. Their defense is that good. He needs to go out there, manage the game, make big throws when the opportunities are there. And Leonard's proven that he can be a guy that can do it, but they do both, just like Jaden Daniels did. He can play in the RPO game. He can sprint out. He can scramble when a play breaks down. He can create with his legs. I think Mike Denbrock will be a guy who's up for the Broyles Award for Best Assistant Coach of the Year. I think he's going to have this Notre Dame offense humming at a high level, come October, November.
And unlike Jaden Daniels, Riley Leonard's not going to have to win games for Notre Dame. Now, Riley Leonard, I do think has the capability to win a game when that's warranted. But Jaden Daniels had to do that every single game last season. Every single game, it was like, all right, fine, I'll do it myself. And Jaden Daniels just picked up the entire team in a little backpack and carried it on his back the entire season because defensively, they had zero support whatsoever. It was the Jaden Daniels show. Well, Riley Leonard has plenty of talent defensively, as we saw on full display in College Station, that Riley Leonard doesn't have to win games. Mike Denbrock doesn't have to put Riley Leonard in that position. And he's got a different skill set than Jaden Daniels. Nobody's a runner like Jaden Daniels, although Riley Leonard does have the ability to make plays with his legs. He doesn't have that same playmaking ability that Jaden Daniels had, but I think Riley Leonard is set up in a much more complementary football situation where they can win games. They can win 12 games this season and find themselves in the playoff. Not a situation that LSU found themselves in last season.
Right. Riley has sneaky wheels, though. Because there were several plays where they had two spies on him defensively, two guys that were just sitting there trying to stop him, and he still managed to get around people to the outside. And y'all, I think there's a really important point with this playoff point, too, because modern college football, I know today over the course of this show, we're going to talk about a lot of different teams. Teams of every fan base, every single fan base should be watching Notre Dame carefully, because if Notre Dame is locked in with an easy schedule and now the opportunity to be the 5 seed, that means if you're one of these SEC teams or Big 12, Big 10 teams that's going to have to go through the gauntlet, there's one less playoff spot open for you unless Notre Dame slips up. This was significant not just for Notre Dame, it was significant for the entire college football landscape, because all of these teams that are looking at maybe being second, third, fourth in their respective conference that want one of these at-large bids, they may have one less at-large bid even available to them. And I think that's massive early in the season.
And look, Notre Dame evaded disaster today because I went into this game thinking Texas A&M's kind of playing with house money, right? It's Mike Elko's very first game as a head coach. Texas A&M has high expectations, but just not quite as high as Notre Dame. That I think Texas A&M fans at the end of the day can say, look, we went toe-to-toe with a really good football team for the better part of 4 quarters. That we can step away from this game really excited about what our football team is moving forward despite the loss. Notre Dame's not in that position. They're not in the quote-unquote moral victory kind of position. It was go on the road in a really tough place to play, get a win, get a resume-boosting win, and then go throughout the rest of your fairly manageable, let's say, cupcake schedule, and then continue on our path to the college football playoff. So I think Notre Dame evading disaster, taking down Texas A&M 23-13 today. Not all teams were as lucky. Georgia and Clemson. My goodness, in the second half, if Georgia didn't put it on Clemson, the Bulldogs take it 34-3. Is the sky falling in Clemson, South Carolina, Adam?
I'll start with this, Caroline. I was wrong. I told you last week that the Georgia-Clemson game would be close. Cade Klubnik would have a coming out party. Clemson would play well in this game. I was completely wrong. And after watching this game and seeing how bad this offense looked, seeing how Georgia's players and how Georgia built their roster through the transfer portal compared to how Clemson's built their roster via high school recruiting and refusing to use the portal, the sky is falling at Clemson. And I think this loss against Georgia in week 1 to get boat raced out of the stadium the way they did is a complete indictment on how Dabo Swinney's building his program and his absolute refusal to adapt to the changing landscape of college football. He has been very vocal about being anti-transfer portal, about not wanting to build his roster through portal, through NIL. And in college football, you either adapt or you get left behind. And right now, Clemson is absolutely left behind. Their offense looks bad. Their quarterback's not playing well, and they clearly don't have the talent that they had in their last playoff appearance in 2019.
It's funny to me the way you say that, because the first thing Caroline said is a battle of the heavyweights. I'm the old guy.
Yeah.
I'll remind everybody what it was like when Mike Tyson was a heavyweight in his prime, and he went in and all he did was kick the snot out of another heavyweight. Like, that's exactly what we saw. We saw like Mike Tyson, which is Georgia in this scenario, but we saw Kermit the Frog like going, that's what Clemson is right now. Like, it's absolute mass chaos, dogs and cats living together. It's hysteria. There's nothing there now for Clemson fans to have hope for. I cannot say that loud enough. The season, if the expectation is a national championship, you just found out in one game that expectation cannot and will not be met. Maybe you can win the ACC if the ACC turns itself upside down. But does that matter for Clemson? They aren't judged by that. For years, they were judged on their basis of can they win a national championship? And what we learned now in this game very clearly is that Clemson is not elite. Clemson is not even secondary to elite. Clemson is mid at this point. And the only way they get out of mid is changing the way they do business. And I don't know, Adam, if Dabo is going to be willing to do that. So I think the sky is falling because of the stubbornness you mentioned. The sky is falling because they don't have the talent. The sky is falling because they're not maximizing the talent. Like, there isn't a reason for the sky not to fall based on what we saw here.
Yeah, I think Clemson's clearly at a crossroads in Dabo Swinney's era. Either something has to change and Dabo has to adapt to the new era of college football, or it's time for him to go. There is no in between anymore. So I think that's the first takeaway. The second for me is this Clemson offense doesn't look like the Clemson offense I thought it would be when they brought in Garrett Riley, their new offensive coordinator last season. When Garrett Riley came in from TCU, I was expecting a high-powered offense with a downfield passing attack, getting the ball down the field vertically, developing Cade Klubnik. This looks like an offense that, quite frankly, Dabo Swinney has his hands on a little bit too much, where he may be influencing too much on what Garrett Riley is really doing from an offensive standpoint. So I think it's frustrating for Clemson fans. I do think the sky is falling, and it's time to seriously think about Dabo Swinney's future. But Caroline, I know you probably had to be smiling when Georgia started to blow this game away in the second half.
Yeah, I think what I would say to that is, I told you so. You sucker. I told you so.
I knew I had that coming. I was waiting for this all day.
And look, I was ready to swallow my words and kind of tuck my tail between my legs whenever offense and points were very, very hard to come by there in the first half. But I don't know what kind of performance-enhancing drug is in a Kirby Smart halftime speech and what kind of halftime adjustments he can make without fail every single game. And we talked about this last week about that Kirby benefit of the doubt, or that Kirby Smart kind of feeling of inevitable. And that's kind of how it felt at halftime was, okay, this Georgia offense struggled a little bit. Carson Beck was admittedly kind of shaken up and a little bit rattled from that Clemson defense in the first half, which looked pretty solid in the first half. But then in the second half, Georgia's offense just looked completely different. Credit to Mike Bobo, the offensive coordinator. But I heard Greg McElroy, who's calling the Clemson-Georgia game, at the start of the game talk about how, Clemson's demise has been over-exaggerated. And look, Greg has forgotten more about football than I will ever know. This is not an indictment on Greg McElroy, but that was the messaging that I feel like we got a lot in the offseason was everyone is over-exaggerating about the steps back that Clemson has taken. And I look at it like, what do we know for certain in this sport? You adapt or you die. That's what made Nick Saban the GOAT, even when he didn't want to embrace the changes. He didn't like the changes in college football. He didn't just embrace them. He became the best at some of those changes in college football, whether it was offensive minds and the way that college football was really changing into a pass-happy, air-it-out kind of offense. Nick Saban embraced that and became an expert at it. When it came to the transfer portal, when it came to NIL, you embrace it and you adapt to it. Dabo Swinney hasn't done that, and you cannot win in modern day college football when you don't utilize the transfer portal.
The most important thing here, guys, that we've learned is that we're not afraid to talk when we're right and eat a little crow when we're wrong. Look at this. Like, we're all coming together. Everybody's accepting their role in all of this.
Friendship.
Yeah. I had to accept that was wrong. And I knew I had that coming. I mean, I saw that there was some chatter on Twitter, or now X, from Caroline. So I knew I was coming into it. I think, to wrap this point up, I think the most staggering stat in Dabo Swinney's era so far is that he has not had one starter via the transfer portal during his time at Clemson. Not one of his starters.
2018.
Crazy. I mean, it's a crazy stat. And you look at some of the best rosters in college football. Look at Ohio State. Look at Oregon. Look at Georgia. Look at some of these elite rosters. They have used the transfer portal to the best of its ability and brought in. I mean, think about Quinshon Judkins coming from Ole Miss to Ohio State, using the portal not just to fill gaps, but to make your roster the best in the country.
But why would you not? I mean, that's the biggest thing. If you have a whole group of players over here that are talented, why would you simply say, I don't want talented players because I don't want to go into that process? Yeah, but you don't eliminate half of the talented players that you can have access to day one. Like, this is so pig-headed and stubborn by a smart football coach that I can't make it make sense.
I agree. But in Dabo Swinney's reasoning is the culture, saying that he wants to build his roster through high school recruiting because that's the way he does it at Clemson. That's the way he's won. He won national championships. That's the way he made multiple playoff appearances. But as Caroline just said, you either adapt or you die in college football. And the game has changed. There's a lot of coaches who don't like the portal, who don't like NIL. I guarantee you, Kirby Smart did not like the transfer portal when it came out. James Franklin didn't like it. Ryan Day didn't like it. Ryan Day doesn't like NIL, I bet. I bet he complains about it to his wife at home, but he's paying his players $20 million a year because he wants to win national championships. You adapt in college football. Dabo Swinney refuses to do it.
Yeah. What kind of culture do you have? I just said, what kind of culture do you have when you just got your ass kicked by 31?
I mean, culture is easy when you're winning. Culture is really difficult when you get your butt whooped on national television. 4 programs that did not take in a single transfer in the 2024 cycle: Army, Navy, Air Force, and Clemson, the 4 branches of the U.S. military. But one transfer that was on full display today, that was Cam Ward at Miami, making his Miami debut after transferring from Washington State. Miami put it on Florida in the swamp. The spread was only 2.5, but Miami whooped them 41-17. It already felt, Fitz, like the sky was falling in Gainesville. Now, add salt into the wound because the sky's on the ground. The sky has fallen in Gainesville, Florida.
And I don't blame the fans for feeling the way they feel. You can't change the fact that you've spent a generation feeling like you're relevant. Now you're in a new SEC where, frankly, you're not going to be. It doesn't even look like, at this point, based today, solely on one game, Vandy looks like a better football team at this point than Florida. And I can't believe I just said that statement. Like, I want to cancel myself for saying that, but that's real. Florida looked absolutely inept. They had no game plan. They couldn't run the ball. If you take away the 171-yard run, the rest of their running game was absolutely inept. Their offense had no flow. Billy Napier at this point, I don't know how he's holding on to his job. And I don't root for coaches to be fired, but let's be real. When you look at the schedule that's in front of this isn't even just, is Florida going to be bowl eligible? The answer to that is clearly no. The question is Florida going to win a couple of games this year? Like, this looked so bad, Adam. I felt bad for Gainesville. I felt bad for the swamp. I just looked at it and thought, man, I cannot imagine watching that trash and trying to figure out in my head how that's Florida football.
Billy Napier's hanging on by the smallest thread you can possibly imagine. They got boat raced out of the stadium. Their quarterback didn't look very good. Their offensive line got pushed around. The Billy Napier era at Florida is just about over. And you bring up the schedule, Fitz. When you look at that schedule, it's hard to even find 2 wins on that schedule right now. I mean, you look at maybe the UCF game. I mean, they got to play A&M, Mississippi State, Tennessee, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State, Texas. I mean, it's hard to imagine how Florida wins more than 2 to 3 games. And when that happens in a locker room, I've been in locker rooms with really bad teams before. When you lose your locker room and your locker room stops believing in your head coach because of decision-making or because of looking at the future, it's done. You got to move on, cut your losses, and go find a coach that can just bring some new momentum and new life into that program. I've been around Billy Napier. He is a good football coach. Players like him. He's a great offensive mind, but his tenure at Florida has not gone well and has really been disastrous from the start. Constant turmoil, constant negativity around the program, and they can't win football games. He's got a pretty big buyout on his contract, but I think Billy Napier is on the hottest seat in the country right now.
Well, and Caroline, like, you know this being in the thick of SEC country, like, at some point when you think about the passion that goes into it, like, you living in Nashville, you know what it means when the Vols aren't good, right? Yeah. You start thinking about what it means for this entire fan base, the donors, everybody, a lot of money. We talk about NIL all the time. What I think we forget sometimes is the consequence of that money that's being spent. You got a bunch of guys that are out there like Friday Night Lights, you know, Buddy Garrity with his car dealership that are saying, where's my money going, right? It just feels like if you just put yourself in SEC country, particularly Florida fans have a right to lose their mind right now.
100%. We're talking about Florida. We're talking about the University of Florida. We are talking about an incredibly rich tradition kind of program with fans that expect to win 9, 10, 11, even 12 games a year. Like, that is what the expectation is at Florida, because that's what Florida football has been for so long. Those expectations are warranted. And this isn't just a bad day at the office for Florida. This is their 6th loss in a row going back to last season. And last season, a year that they weren't even bowl eligible. And I think for me, the most frustrating, or maybe the most disappointing thing about Florida's performance today was everything that I expected to get better from last season, frankly, didn't. Last year, Florida was a really young team. And I think the way that Billy Napier could have sold the message to the fans was, look, they got 30% of our starting defense are all true freshmen, okay? So they're not going to look good. They're going to make some mistakes, but they're going to get that experience, and they're going to be that much better in year 2. I didn't see a drastically improved defense. I didn't see a defense that, okay, those guys have played a lot of football, or those guys have seen a lot of things. Ron Roberts comes in, a really well-respected defensive mind, kind of be a little bit of a teacher to a young Austin Armstrong defensive coordinator. I didn't see the impact game 1. We saw Graham Mertz, I think, get better and better and better each game last season. Graham Mertz through 3 quarters didn't even throw for 100 yards. So It just felt like every area where Florida was showing some warts, they really did. They did not improve year over year. That's the biggest indictment, I think, on Billy Napier so far, is they haven't gotten better. It's one thing to keep things close in a really tough fought kind of game. It wasn't close from the start.
And you make a great point there, Caroline, on the young players in that Florida program. You know, Graham Mertz didn't look good. You just said it. 91 yards passing on the day. Not going to cut it when you're playing a team like Miami. But then 5-star quarterback DJ Lagway came in at the end of that game. And the one thing to give Billy Napier some hope could have been if Lagway comes in and plays really well. He's the 5-star quarterback, the prize recruit that Billy Napier landed. And if he played well, maybe there's some hope there for the future. But then Lagway came in and went 3 for 6 with an interception, did not play well, looked flustered out there. You mentioned some of the other young players. Some of the young players on defense didn't play well. There really isn't a bright spot to point to in this Florida program right now.
I think the other part of it, Adam, you've talked a lot about culture, and we've all have. But the other thing that you have to see in week 0, week 1, week 2 to me is identity. And if you go out there and you get your butt whooped, but I see what you're trying to do and I see who you're trying to be and I figure out the identity throughout that process, I can say, okay, I understand where this team is going. I walked away from that Florida game saying, I have no idea what they even think their strengths are. There wasn't a time where I thought they were dialing into these are the 20 plays that we can just rely. These are the 10 plays we can rely on. They never had a moment in this game where they really pocketed into something that I could say that's the future of Florida football. If you're going to get your butt kicked, at least show us identity. Because they didn't, I have no idea how Florida turns this thing around, Caroline.
They don't have an opportunity to. Week 2, they host Samford, so that's a game that you feel like they should win. And then they host Texas A&M. They go on the road at Mississippi State. I don't think Mississippi State is any sort of world beaters, but also Florida doesn't look like that either. Like, that game could absolutely be considered a toss-up. You host UCF. You know that Gus Malzahn is going to be fired up and ready to prove himself against an SEC opponent. They go at Tennessee, an incredibly difficult place to play. We saw Nico Iamaleava look fantastic today against UT Chattanooga. Host Kentucky, host Georgia, at Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, and Florida State. I don't see any sort of room for breath there for Billy Napier and the Florida Gators. And Fitz, I think you make a great point. I didn't see an identity. I didn't see a team that looked, 1, motivated, and 2, looked like they were trying to figure out who they want to be. So a lot of panicking happening in week 1. And frankly, if you're Clemson or Florida, panicking is very much so justified. We'll continue the week 1 reaction, break down one thing that we learned in week 1. We'll get to that after a quick break. All right, let's get into what we learned in week 1. A lot of lessons every single week. Adam, we'll start with you. What'd you learn this week?
The Big Ten is the deepest conference in college football, Caroline. And there's a lot of talk, right, about the SEC, I heard Joel Klatt say the Big 12 is the deepest conference in college football this week. But I think what we saw from not the top tier teams in the Big Ten, we know Oregon, Michigan are all going to win a lot of games this season. But from these middle tier teams in the Big Ten, looked really good and really strong. Penn State looked like a playoff caliber team against West Virginia. Iowa won 40-0. Nebraska looked really good, won 40-7. Dylan Raiola, their 5-star quarterback, was electric. Maryland won 50-7 against UConn. There's no question that this is the deepest conference in college football. You have two of the teams with the best rosters in the country with Ohio State and Oregon, and then just deep play week after week. And some of those middle of the pack teams that I just mentioned showed that they're, the top tier of college football rosters and talent from how they perform today.
Yeah, one of those teams you mentioned, this is a tease. Later on, I'm going to tell you why I'm selling. I don't buy into it at all. But I got to give you credit, Breneman, because you were in on this Nebraska thing, and I was curious to see what Raiola looked like. And frankly, it was a thing of beauty watching that. Like that, Matt Rule with a quarterback is a much different beast when you try and figure out how to defend him. I was watching Nebraska hoping that I could come in and poke the belly of the beast with you, brother, but I can't. That was a solid performance by them.
Hey, I started getting some texts and some tweets, and it was like the first quarter, and the game was pretty close. So that Nebraska game, people were starting to bring that take, my Nebraska playoff take up to me. But yeah, and I think too, Matt Rule in year 2. He does such a good job of developing those programs. In what he did at Temple and Baylor, you look at the year 2 jump, his teams always make a massive improvement in that year 2. Caroline, Big Ten, deepest conference. What do you think?
I saw Oregon get a little bit of a scare against Idaho. Saw Michigan keep things a little bit too close for comfort against Fresno State, and perennial Big Ten contender UCLA making things a little bit interesting against Hawaii. And I understand week 1, weird things are going to happen when teams are figuring out what they want to do with new quarterbacks, new coordinators, so on and so forth. I don't entirely disagree with you though, because Ohio State looked as advertised, one of the best teams in the conference. Penn State was one team that I had a lot of question marks about, of exactly who are you going to be in year 1 of the new Big Ten? Are you going to ascend to being one of the contenders? Or are you kind of going to fall back into mediocrity in kind of the middle of the conference? We don't know the answer to that quite yet, but I liked what I saw. And I remember hearing all last season that Penn State fans were just hungry for big plays. Open up the playbook, take the deep shots, let Drew Aller kind of take some of those more calculated risks. We didn't see that last year, which made me think that I didn't think Penn State was going to be all that interesting to watch if they were just going to continue kind of a conservative offense. I loved seeing Drew Aller open it up a little bit. So I don't know if I'm necessarily buying deepest conference in the country, but a very strong point. A very, very fair point. Fitzy, what did we learn today?
That everybody needs to relax, calm down. Look, the funniest thing to me, my phone's
not
blowing
in this
up.
sport,
including us. Including
no
us.
such thing as calming
we
down.
don't need to relax at all. No, we're
not
doing
in college
God's
football.
like fans, and look, one of my buddies texted me halftime of the Michigan game. Was like, this whole season's a waste. I can't believe that we're going through this. And I'm like, dude, it's halftime. I knew people that were texting me because Ohio State was struggling early against Akron. Like you just start to look all the way across the board. And what did we see? We saw just awful first halves of football. And a couple of days ago, I said on the show, I thought we needed preseason. Well, what did we get? We got a half a preseason in a bunch of these football games. And I think everybody needs to calm down and remember, number one, it takes a minute when you haven't had joint practices against other schools at the same level. You got a bunch of kids that are trying to figure out how to play college football. Like, it's going to take a minute. It's going to favor defenses, hammer the unders a lot. Like that all makes sense. Yeah. But the other part of it is a win is a win. So if you go through all of this ugly and you still come out with a win, instead of being despondent about our quarterback can't play, like acknowledge that maybe next week's going to look a little different. Maybe next week's going to get a little better, and you still got to win out of a bad situation. I think that there is still value in being challenged week 0, week 1. I think there's value in trying to figure these things out. I just think the problem is, Adam, we have so many eyeballs on it, and everybody's ready to freak out after one bad quarter, one bad half, when realistically, these teams are going to take a second to figure out who they are.
There are so many instances in college football, early weeks, where a team like in Ohio State, like in Oregon, one of these teams is down or winning by 7 points at halftime, and everyone thinks the world's going to fall apart. Everyone thinks, as we call it, the sky is falling. There's a reason the game is 4 quarters. Right? So many times we'll see a 10-7 game at halftime end up being a 50-7 game with these powerhouse teams playing FCS or group of 5 opponents. Happens all the time because what you just said, Fitz, getting the jitters out, playing against someone that's not your own teammate for the first time in a long time, but also these group of 5 and FCS teams can't hang with the talent and the depth of these big time programs. So Everyone ignore the bad first half. Okay, that's just part of the game, part of growing early in the season. Also, there's a lot of coaches in college football who would prefer to have a close call early in the season as opposed to blowing out an FCS team, blowing out a group of 4 team, group of 5 team, and then never having that true test until you get to your conference play. A lot of teams would take that 14-point win when you should have won by 40, but it teaches your team a lot of lessons. And as a coach, you can go in front of your team and say, we got the win, but we're not as good as you guys thought you were on that field. And it's time to improve this coming week before we get to conference play.
Nick Saban this morning on Game Day actually talked about the fact that last year, the fact that they struggled early helped the team grow to where they were to be a playoff team by the end of the year. We need to have a little of that context before we decide that some of these teams are just absolutely, especially if you won, Caroline. That's all I'm saying. If you won, maybe we could relax.
And I think there's two sides of the coin of maybe a bad first half or a bad game in week 1. It's really easy to get all, your panties all in a wad about. I also think it's the truth that maybe let's slow down whenever you drop a hundo on Furman, no disrespect to Furman, that maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to win the national championship. Maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that your quarterback is going to be a Heisman Trophy contender.
Whoa. Some of us picked Ole Miss to make it to the national championship game on this show. I need that to mean that.
And I chose Furman just as a random example. I am not necessarily calling Ole Miss out by name, but that's one of them. We saw so much joyless murder ball today, and rightfully so, because that's why you schedule these games. You pay an FCS opponent or a Division III school a couple $1 million to come in and get their butts kicked so your young quarterback can gain some confidence so you can get a dub on the schedule. That's the purpose of these games. It might teach you something, but it doesnesn't teach you everything.
If this show is not called Joyless Murder Ball or whatever, if that's not the title of this episode, then we are cowards. Joyless Murder Ball. That's all. Go ahead.
And sometimes you can find a little bit of joy in the Joyless Murder Ball. When you see the score bug go up 64-0, it's just, it's a nice little sense of dominance, I think. But talking about some lessons that we learned today, I always say, like I just said, you can learn some things in week 1, but it's not everything. We have a lot of football left to play. A lot of things can change throughout the course of a season, but I am going to go ahead and already transport myself to December in New York City because I know that if I'm there, Cam Ward will also be there. That's what I learned today. Cam Ward at Miami is a Heisman Trophy contender. And full disclosure, I talked about this last week. I thought Miami was getting a little bit too much hype. I wanted to see it from Cam Ward before I truly believed it. And I know that you can say, well, you just called out Florida's defense for not being very good. Now you're all of a sudden going to say that Cam Ward is a Heisman Trophy contender. But everything that everyone was selling me on what Cam Ward could be at Miami, we saw that on Saturday. 385 yards on 26 passes, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, added some yards on the ground. And the interception to me was the most telling thing of anything with Cam Ward. Threw the interception, and then got right back out there on the next possession like nothing ever happened. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't overwhelmed. Nick Saban always talks about how what made Bryce Young so great was the fact that he was a goldfish. He can make a mistake and completely forget about it and be, as cool, calm, and collected as you were before. I saw that from Cam Ward. We didn't see a whole lot of Cam Ward just in terms of gaudy numbers with his legs, but he was so smooth with his legs. He reminded me a lot of Jaden Daniels, just so slippery, could find the small holes and could run, just made it look so easy. So I'm calling it now. Cam Ward's going to find himself in New York, not only because of his ability, but also because I think Miami could go undefeated the rest of the season. They don't have anyone that really sticks out on their schedule to me, Fitz.
But that's the reason he can't make it to New York, because there's not a signature win left. The only ranked opponent right now on the rest of their schedule is Florida State, and Florida State may not be ranked by the time he gets there. And unfortunately, because the Heisman votes before we get to the playoffs, I agree with you that he's going to put up big numbers, but I just don't know how those big numbers translate if he's putting up big numbers against, Nashville Auto Diesel College. Like, it just
400 yards a game if for a quarterback from an undefeated potentially team. Like, if we find ourselves in that position, let's say Miami's 11-1 and Cam Ward is consistently putting up about 400 yards and 3 touchdowns a game. You cannot tell me that guy isn't a Heisman contender.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if after this weekend, Cam Ward's a top 2, top 3 Heisman odds guy. I mean, Miami's going to win the ACC after what we just saw and how Cam Ward performed. I think we'll see Cam Ward on the Heisman stage. I think it's a great pick, Caroline. Cam Ward, you mentioned his legs. The best part of his game to me, from what we saw on Saturday, was not the run game, but just how he evaded pressure in the pocket. Only took 1 sack during that game, which is incredibly impressive with all the pressure he was getting, how poised he was in the pocket. You called him smooth. I think that's a great description. Just looks smooth and effortless back there and was able to evade pressure and has great feel in the pocket. Really, that feel, being able to just understand where guys are, even if you can't see them with your eyes, is what makes quarterbacks really great and what allows them to evade the pressure and evade sacks. Cam Ward has that. My other favorite part of Cam Ward is just the intangible part. He's everything you want in a quarterback and in a leader. I watched his post-game press conference, and he got asked about how he's going to celebrate the big win as finally a Miami quarterback, and he said, I'm going to celebrate for 15, 20 minutes with my teammates, and I'll move on to next week. Like, he's a dog, and he's the guy that could have been a first-round NFL draft pick, decided to stay in college, go to Miami, and help rebuild this program. And I'm high on Miami right now, and a big part is because Cam Ward is their quarterback.
The one word you guys didn't use that I think also is important for Cam's play today was decisive. He knew where he was going with the ball, did a really nice job of getting that ball in accurately. Even when, as smooth as he was stepping up in the pocket, it felt like his mechanics still stayed with him, right? He was able to deliver those footballs so well. Like, it was an incredibly impressive performance. I would love to see him be on the Heisman stage. I still will stand by, especially I'm concerned about that offensive line throughout the course of the rest of the year. Is he just going to get absolutely hammered? And then I'm concerned about the strength of schedule for Miami moving forward. But you're right. Inevitably, somebody from the ACC has to make the playoffs. So why not them?
And after today, which we will get into, it's almost like, I guess somebody from the ACC has to get in. Okay, fine. We will give you a playoff spot as just a little bit of a treat. All right, we'll take a quick break here, but on the other side, going to get into some college football stock exchange. Whose stock is rising? Whose stock is falling? Whose stock are we getting in on right now? Because it could be on a meteoric rise. We'll get into all of that after just a quick break. All right, college football stock exchange. Whose stock is rising? Whose stock is falling? Fitzy, put your NASDAQ cap on. Get your dollars and cents out of your wallet. Get ready to invest. Whose stock are you buying?
I mean, I'm usually investing in my betting apps, and that hasn't gone particularly well so far. All right, here's what we can all agree on. I'll go with a quick stock up on this because, Caroline, you broke it down earlier. I know, Adam, you agree with this. Stock's way up on Penn State. For me, it was about seeing a new offense for them, pushing the ball down the field, Adam. It was impressive to watch Drew Aller really cook in this, and I walked away from it saying, wow, I think I might be underestimating Penn State.
I mean, this is the season for Penn State. We talked about it on our first episode of this show. Penn State needs to make the college football playoff in 2024. There's nothing else at stake for James Franklin. He has to make the playoff. And the first question for me was, is the defense as elite as it was last year? That's the first thing. And the answer was yes. Defensive line's great. There's some insane speed on this defense. Abdul Carter at defensive end. So check off the defensive box. But what you just said, Fitz, the big question mark has been the offense. Can the offense get better? And it clearly did. The explosive plays were a huge issue last season. James Franklin made a change at offensive coordinator, brought in Andy Kotelnicki from Kansas, and this looked like a completely different, much more confident offense at Penn State. I mean, Penn State scored touchdowns on 4 of their first 7 drives. Drew Aller was firing on all cylinders. One of the best parts was seeing Drew Aller early in that game miss a couple throws and then come back and be even more dialed in. Made a couple of throws, made a throw on a play action pass post route down the middle of the field to Harrison Wallace that was right on his face mask. I mean, Drew Aller looked like the 5-star quarterback, the projected top 10 draft pick that everyone thinks he is. He looked like that person, and that's what I wanted to see. Drew have that kind of swagger. Also, Penn State's backup quarterback, Bo Pribula, got to play some in that RPO zone read game and got to give Aller a breather a couple times. I thought Pribula looked really good. This is an offense that I think has a chance to be one of the best in the country. And the other position group that's been a question at Penn State has been the wide receiver room. And Harrison Wallace, Trey Wallace, as they call him, goes for 100+ yards and 2 touchdowns, answering that question at wide receiver. And to cap it off, I mean, West Virginia's a really good team. They're going to win 8, 9, I think maybe 10 games this season in the Big 12. You look at their schedule, that's a solid West Virginia team that Penn State really dominated from start to finish. Ended up being a 6-hour game, but with the lightning delay. But Penn State proved that they are a playoff caliber team, and I don't really see, when you look at their schedule, how they don't make the playoff if their offense plays the way they did today.
The West Virginia point's a really important one that I wanted to drill in on here, because I don't think this is an indictment of West Virginia. And to do that on the road against a quality West Virginia team, this wasn't taken on Furman, right? To use the earlier example. So I think, I know, I know
they're getting trashed today. I mean,
they got paid. They got paid. Look, you guys can kick the snot out of me for a couple $1 million. Like, I'll just lay down and
tears with $1 bill. Thank you very much.
But I will. If I'm up on Penn State, I'll give you a shocking down. Okay, because I know that you guys will not agree with this. But look, my stock is way down on Iowa. And I know they went out and they won big. But here's the thing to me. Breneman, you know this as well as anybody. You can't just watch the box score. You can't just look at the way it happened. You got to watch the plays, right? Cade McNamara was staggeringly inaccurate in this game. He had wide open guys that he wasn't even close to. And some of their touchdowns came on incredible catches made in literally triple coverage. If you're doing that against an awful opponent, what are you going to do when you actually take on a good opponent? I don't think what Iowa accomplished will translate when they're taking on a decent team, because if you just watch the way they were playing, the eye test, as the committee likes to say, above and beyond the score, the eye test showed me that Iowa's offense is still wildly out of sync, Adam. So I'm out. I'm selling Iowa right now. I don't care about the score. I care about the execution, and the execution wasn't good enough.
I can't believe that Iowa scored 40 points, and you're putting them on the stock down report.
I'm a tough judge.
I never thought that Iowa would score 40 points anytime this decade. I can't remember the last time they scored more than 21 points. Someone will have to fact check me on that, but I think when you're Iowa and you have the kind of defense they have and you play the kind of style they play, you don't need to score a lot of points.
But it's Illinois State. It's Illinois State. It's not even Illinois.
It's still 40 points. It's not even Illinois. It's still 40 points. And I agree with you that Cade McNamara was not blowing anybody out of the water today. But that's he doesn't need to be. He doesn't need to do that. The Iowa formula is to manage the game at quarterback, chew a bunch of the clock, and play elite defense. All three of those things are still going to happen. Cade McNamara did all three of those things today. Oh, yeah. And he threw for 3 touchdowns, and they put up 40 points.
Those 3 touchdowns were lucky. You know, if you were playing college football 25 and you threw that, you'd be like, wrong button. A lucky touchdown.
What's a lucky touchdown?
If you got to scream go gadget arms to get up between 3 different defenders and bring the ball down, like, that's a lucky touchdown. I'm just saying.
Caroline, can you help me here? Can you help me with Fitz here? 40 points for Iowa?
Against Illinois State.
And 500 total yards of offense. I don't know if Iowa had 500 total yards of offense all of last season in every single game combined. No, I hear you, Fitz, that sometimes the numbers don't always tell the full story, and that Iowa's offense was so miserable and has been for the past couple of seasons that you're going to have to see a little bit more of it to believe it. I get it. I totally understand it. But to Adam's point, look into the formula, how Iowa wants to win football games. They win football games by having a solid offensive line, creating room in the run game, and by playing elite defense. It wasn't the passing numbers that stood out to me. It was the rushing numbers that stood out to me. Yeah. Almost 250 yards rushing. If Iowa runs the ball that effectively and plays as good of defense as we know Iowa can play, like that's the formula right there. All Cade McNamara has to do is not turn the football over. But that's not asking for too much.
A formula for what? Like, if Iowa wants to be a playoff team, then there's no way. Like, to me, you're right. The formula to losing 3 or 4 games and being Iowa that frustrates everybody, sure. If that's the formula, that's fine. But running the ball against Illinois State doesn't impress me. And I'll go back to one seam route. Everybody find it on YouTube. There was a seam route where Cade McNamara had the guy wide open, and instead of putting any air under the ball, he throws it to the guy's feet. It hit him behind, like it hit the defender in the feet. It wasn't even close to being accurate. Like an 8th grader could have made a better throw there. I'm looking at this saying, what are we doing? Like, we're supposed to be. You got your coach suspended for a game because that's what they needed to get you in as the quarterback, and you can't hit a wide open guy in a seam route against Illinois State? Come on, I'm selling.
We're having different conversations. If we're going to talk about Iowa through the lens of, are they a national championship contender versus can they make some noise in the Big Ten and potentially, slay some dragons and take down some giants? Like, I am more so in that headspace of, Iowa can make things interesting, and maybe Iowa football won't be like sticking needles in my eyes watching that offense. National championship contenders, that's a completely different conversation.
Look at that schedule. That schedule is soft. That schedule is Charmin soft. All they got to do, like, Iowa has a very real path to the Big Ten championship game by going through a Charmin schedule. But I still don't trust Cade McNamara.
Hey, I'm going to be completely honest. When Fitz said he was putting Iowa on stock down, I thought he made a mistake and meant to put him on stock up after this game. I thought it was a mistake. I mean, come on, man. 40 points for Iowa, 500 yards of offense. Come on.
Yeah, maybe Fitz is just.
But then we're not going to credit Ole Miss for putting 3,000 points up against Furman. All right,
you don't get a cookie for that. But maybe Fitz is a very intelligent financial mind, selling the stock while it's high. Buy low, sell high.
That's good.
That's what they tell me. Speaking of that, are you buying or selling stock this week, Adam?
I am selling the ACC. Just a brutal week 1 and week 0 for the ACC. Caroline, I think I saw you tweeted, is anyone in the ACC good? The answer is
no.
Miami is very good, but no one else is. Florida State had the bad loss in week 0. Clemson starts 0-1 with an ugly loss that we talked about. Virginia Tech losing a game they should not lose to Vanderbilt. Vandy played really well, but just a bad loss for the ACC there to the worst team in the SEC. North Carolina barely hung on against Minnesota, who's a bottom 3 Big Ten team. Their quarterback, Max Johnson, was out for the year, and they still barely beat them. NC State was on upset alert against Western Carolina the entire game on Thursday. SMU had to score a last-second touchdown as its 27, 28, 29-point favorite. ACC stock is plummeting, and it is pretty clear now the ACC is 4 out of 4 in the Power 4 conferences. Big 12 is a better conference. They're deeper, and it's time to sell the ACC stock as fast as you can.
The only objection I have to your concept of selling it is who is dumb enough to buy it in the first place. I'm just like, that's all I'm saying.
Penny stocks.
Out on the ACC is a show theme at this point. We got this.
Yeah, the ACC, it's been a tough sledding over the last couple of weeks. And that was the biggest conversation after Florida State lost to Georgia Tech of, okay, now who's the favorite? Clemson emerged as the betting favorite. Okay, Clemson looked horrendous against Georgia. Yeah. Who's gonna basically take up the softball and take the ACC? It's a very, very fair point. But in that same breath, as I'm trashing on the ACC, I'm still going to buy all the stock on a certain ACC quarterback. And I'm going to buy the stock on maybe that entire team and really just an overarching conversation on college football in general. I'm buying stock in the transfer portal.
Yeah.
And hear me out here. I'm talking about Cam Ward. We mentioned him earlier, had a fantastic performance, did everything that you could ask him to do against Florida. I look at Tyler Barron, who transferred into Miami from Tennessee to Louisville, back to Tennessee, back to Miami. Kind of transfer portal inception there, but he was fantastic. He was in Graham Mertz's face all game long. He had a sack and 2 TFLs. I look at Georgia's wide receivers, the 2 receivers that found the end zone for the Bulldogs today. London Humphreys, a transfer from Vanderbilt, and Colby Young, a transfer from Miami. Adam, you brought up Quinshon Judkins, running back that transferred into Ohio State from Ole Miss. We saw what Riley Leonard, quarterback at Notre Dame, was able to do against Texas A&M, a transfer from Duke. And I understand that there are so many transfer portal players in college football that it's easy for me to cherry pick really good performances from certain transfer portal players. I get that. Like, there's probably several very mundane performances from transfer portal players today and throughout the rest of the season. But the reason why I think that this is an appropriate conversation to have today was because we saw on full display Dabo Swinney's approach to the transfer portal really bite him in the face. So stock up to the transfer portal and some of the performances that we saw from transfer portal players today.
Yeah, I love that. I love that take. I think, too, the transfer portal and the opportunities it's given a lot of these players who needed kind of second chances in their careers. I mean, I think back to a guy I played with in college, like a Will Levis, who was at Penn State, wasn't going to play at all, transfers at Kentucky, ends up being a top NFL draft pick, now starting quarterback in the NFL. Like, those stories don't happen if there's no transfer portal. And just the opportunity for a guy like a Cam Ward, who obviously we're talking about a lot today, that everyone here is high on, to decide not to go to the NFL and stay in college football, gives us more stuff to talk about, a better product for college football fans, and transfer into a premier program and become one of the biggest names in the country. You think about a guy like a Dylan Gabriel, who is at Oklahoma, probably is going to get beat out by the 5-star quarterback they brought in, and then gets a chance to go to Oregon. You think about, we mentioned Riley Leonard at Notre Dame, who his head coach leaves. He gets to go to Notre Dame and play in a premier program. The stories like this is endless in college football. Yes, there's bad in it. Yes, some of the coaches don't like it. Yes, it's tough to deal with when it comes to roster management. But the transfer portal overall has made the college football product and the game of college football much better for fans, us as analysts, and people who cover it for a living. It's been fun to watch because of the portal.
Anytime you can extend somebody's opportunity to play football, knowing so many of the kids that play college football won't have the chance to play in the pros, it's a beautiful thing. I will also add, we need to remember that one of the most important positions in an NFL organization, and fans rarely think about this, is the pro player scouting department. It's their job to make sure they know who's out there in the league that can fill holes as the season goes on. I think what we're seeing right now from the usage of the transfer portal, it's not just about getting guys. It's about making sure that you have the right scouts on your staff that are able to look around the college football landscape and figure out who in the transfer portal fits what you're doing. Instead of burying your head in the sand and saying, I don't want to take part in it, you need to bring people onto your staff that are simply combing through footage of everybody to try and figure out, here's a guy that can help us, here's a guy that can help us. Because in an NIL transfer portal world, I think, Caroline, that becomes more and more important. So I love the point by you. It's brilliantly done. And I think the transfer portal is one of the best things that's happened to college football.
No doubt. And you could find so many examples of how the transfer portal may have hurt the sport or may have hurt individual careers. There are going to be examples of that one way or another whenever you have just the sheer numbers of players in the transfer portal. But I think that we've seen it on full display that Dabo Swinney's approach, it's not working. It's setting the program back. Now, will we see kind of the antithesis to that? How will we see that play out? Colorado, Ole Miss, teams and coaches that have had really aggressive approaches to the transfer portal. Will we see an opposite effect? Will we see going way too far on one side of the coin isn't a good thing, that you need to find that happy medium? I think that's going to be one of the fun lessons that we find out this college football season. In terms of stock up on the transfer portal, stock up on a team that I would be remiss if I didn't mention as a proud Nashvilleian, as someone who just lives a hop and a skip away from this football stadium. Stock up to the Vanderbilt Commodores. And more so, stock up to whoever took the over on Vanderbilt's over-under win total, which was set at 3.5 before the season started. And looking at the rest of Vanderbilt's schedule, they got Alcorn State, Ball State, and Georgia State with one win on the schedule so far. Assuming that those are 3 games that Vanderbilt can win, that's 4 right there, and you're not even getting into SEC play. Shout out to Vanderbilt, took down Virginia Tech in overtime today. Diego Pavia looks like the truth, another transfer portal player that showed out today. So shout out to all of those bettors who placed money on Vanderbilt over-under. It's looking good. It's looking good. One game in.
You know what? Bowl season's worst nightmare. I lived in Nashville for more than 20 years. Bowl season worst nightmare is Vandy making a bowl. Because there'll be 6 Vandy fans that are out there giving you the VU fingers and screaming, "Go Doors!" Like, it's just it's like that's a nightmare for the Motor City Bowl when they're like, "Great, no tourism coming this time." Like, good on you, Vandy. It's a huge win. I'm really impressed. Clark Lee, congratulations. Maybe the program is starting to turn around. But as you may remember, Caroline, I lived in Nashville during the height of James Franklin, and even during the height of James Franklin, the smallest stadium in the SEC couldn't fill up. And he used to sit there and he would do radio. Like when I was hosting radio, he would come on our show and be like, "We need people to come out to the game." Like, I would love to care about Vandy. I'll care about Vandy as soon as Vandy students care about Vandy. That's all I'm saying, Adam. As soon as they care, I'll care.
Well, I think the fact that Vandy now has a signature win on their resume, especially, I can't think of the last signature win Vanderbilt's had.
Tennessee. They
Florida.
beat Tennessee. There were a few years ago that they beat Tennessee pretty regularly. That was a big deal.
To be fair, that was like 10 years ago when they beat Tennessee. But they beat Florida and Kentucky a couple years ago.
Can I say in the Clark Lee era of Vanderbilt, the last signature win they had, I think now that they have that win, maybe some of the Nashville people start paying attention. Also, let's remember Virginia Tech. I put Virginia Tech on my top 4 playoff sleepers heading into this season. Virginia Tech's supposed to be one of the best rosters in college football, some of the most talent returning in the country on that Virginia Tech roster. So, and I think the most encouraging part about the Vanderbilt win, when you watch that game, there were about 8 to 10 plays that Vanderbilt had to make to win that game. If they don't make one of those plays, they lose. If they make 7 out of the 8, Virginia Tech wins that game. And they made every single play Pavia made huge plays with his legs, getting the ball. Vanderbilt got the ball back with 5 minutes left, down by 7 points, put that drive together to go tie the game. I thought maybe they were going to go for 2 to try to win it, but ended up kicking it, taking it to overtime, ended up being the right choice. Big win for the Vanderbilt program, and I certainly hope that Fitz took Vanderbilt's win total over. But it sounds like he didn't by how he reacted.
No, nobody ever takes Vanderbilt's win. I'll say I have a Vandy helmet hanging in a room in my house. Like, look, I've gone to Vandy games for years, and me, the three of us. This is the most Vanderbilt conversation that's happened in Nashville in the last 15 years.
That is probably. I'm just such a sucker for the underdog. The nerdy kid that's sitting by himself in the cafeteria and all the bullies are saying, give me your lunch money. Like, I want to cheer for that guy. That's what Vanderbilt is.
How long is that stadium going to take to finish? Have they been renovating that thing for like 3 years now? Is that what's going on with that thing?
It's been a minute. There are no longer cranes holding up the scoreboard.
Okay,
so that's progress. And we will take progress. Absolutely. Week 1 in the books. And if week 1 was any indication of what's to come for the rest of the college football season, buckle up, because we are in for a wild ride. He is Adam Breneman. He is Jason Fitz. I am Caroline Fenton. You can find him at Adam Breneman81. You can find him at Jason Fitz. You can find me at Caroline Fenton1. That's going to do it for us for the week 1 reaction edition of the College Football Power Hour. Like, rate, review, subscribe, all of that great things. Appreciate you all for listening and for supporting the podcast. Tell a friend about us. Do all of the great things. We are back here on Wednesday and, of course, every Sunday morning with a full reaction to all of the action on Saturday. We might also have a fun little surprise edition. Week 1 action is not over. We've got LSU and USC in Vegas. So check us out, our full reaction wherever you get your podcasts and on Yahoo Sports YouTube. For Adam, for Fitz, I'm Caroline. We are out.